Hello and welcome back to Franklin Covey's twice weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. That's me. I'm your host each week, where on Tuesdays and Fridays, we curate new podcast episodes, both in audio and video, all designed to make you a better leader, to make you more effective. Of course, Franklin Covey is the sponsor of this podcast, now the world's largest weekly leadership podcast, where we focus our spotlight globally on people that have complementary interests to ours. It may be adjacent to the topic of leadership, marketing, management, executing strategy, how to become a better artist, curator, creator. And today's topic will be how to become more disciplined in your thought and your thinking. Our guest today is Shane Parrish. You may know him as the founder of Farnam Street and the newsletter Brain Food that has nearly 730,000 subscribers. We tend to throw around these massive numbers, but I know what it takes to create a newsletter that has almost 750,000 followers, decades in discipline, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Maybe Shane will share us some insights for those of you who likely are trying to create content and delivery to who are your followers as well. Today, we're going to focus on his most recent release, the best-selling book, Clear Thinking, Turning Ordinary Moments into Extraordinary Results. Joining us from Ottawa, Canada today, Shane, welcome to On Leadership.
Thanks for having me, Scott. I'm excited to be here.
Canadian style. You're in a very interesting background there. Looks like you're in the witness protection program. For those of you who may be watching us, why the dark? Why the set?
Oh, it's just the office. I'm in a shared office, and I put sound panels in the office to help dampen the sound between the different offices.
Well, you sound great. For those of you who may be watching or just listening, it looks like Shane is in an interrogation chamber in some 3-letter agency, which isn't far from his history. Shane, a lot has been written about you and your journey now to the authorship and the design of Farnam Street. We'll get there in a moment. Would you take a couple of minutes, rewind, because you've had a fascinating career that's brought you now to what you do for a living. Talk about your early education, if you will, your career, and maybe touch on both Farnam Street and Brain Food.
Yeah, so I started working for a 3-letter intelligence agency 2 weeks before September 11th. And as we know, the world changed on September 11th. I had a computer science background, and I went into this working with the most incredibly talented and smart engineers in the world. 2 weeks later, I didn't leave the building. It was like nobody left the building. We all worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. Everybody's doing a whole bunch of things that they aren't really trained for. There's no experience that they had that prepared them for this, because the world had changed overnight and we're just doing the best that we can. And you're around a group of people who are all doing that, which is really actually quite energizing. You'd think it would be draining to work that much, but it wasn't. And that's how Farnam Street started. I started making decisions, and I wanted to be the best at making decisions that I could be, but nobody had ever taught me how to make decisions. There was no class in university called decision making. It's all these discrete skills that you have to assemble together, but everybody expects you to know how to make decisions already. And I didn't really know how to make them, and I didn't really have a way out of making them. So I had to get better at making them. So I started following people around in the organization, started following around our senior managers, our deputy minister, and just sort of like sitting in the back of the room and listening to how people actually made decisions. And, I was expecting this big insight. It didn't really happen. And then so I was like, well, there must be something I'm missing. And, I started Googling, how do I make better decisions? And this is like 2005, 2006. And that sort of led me to doing an MBA, because I figured this was like the holy grail. I will finally get into this room with a whole bunch of educated, smart people, and I will learn the secrets to decision making. And, that sort of led me astray for a while. And I started looking to the outside, and I'm like, well, why do people consistently make better decisions than other people? Why do some people seem to be super lucky and other people don't seem to be lucky? And so I started reaching out to them. And through this, I started a website called Farnam Street. And to keep in mind, so it's fs.blog, but I wasn't allowed to have a website at the time. So the original website was 68131-1440.blogger.com, because I wasn't even allowed to have an internet presence. I wasn't allowed to have my name online, wasn't allowed a Facebook page, a LinkedIn page, wasn't even allowed like an email address with my name in it. And so we were super in the shadows, but I was taking all this stuff that I was learning from the outside and I was sort of bringing it back into the organization. And I wasn't writing about intelligence agencies. I was writing about how do I take this theoretical stuff I'm learning in my MBA and apply it? How do I take this conversation I just had with Daniel Kahneman and apply it inside the organization so that we could get better at making decisions?
Shane, in your book, Clear Thinking, you have four, if you will, sort of challenges, defaults as to what prevents us from clear thinking. You call them enemies. And I want to talk about those as I think they're especially relevant to every business leader, entrepreneur, solopreneur, entrepreneur. But the premise of your book really has two thoughts. One is that in order to think clearly, we must first create the space to reason in our thoughts, feelings, and actions. And then second, we must deliberately use that space to think clearly. You think this actually is a skill and can become a competitive advantage. Riff on that premise, if you will, first.
Well, let me just rewind just a little second if I can. So when I started studying these people who consistently make better decisions than other people, one of the things that I discovered that is very underappreciated is that they're never in a position where they're forced by circumstances to make a bad decision. If you look at Warren Buffett, he's rarely in his entire career has he ever been forced by a stock market crash, by debt being called, by anything into doing something he doesn't want to do. And I was having dinner with Charlie Munger one night, and he sort of alluded to that, and I thought about it. And then I walked away thinking, there's something here about the position that you're in. There's something about this that makes thinking easier or harder. So the conclusion that I sort of drew from this was everybody looks like a genius if all of their options are great. And even Warren Buffett looks like an idiot if he has no good options. So there's this concept of positioning. And then I started thinking about, well, what are the circumstances that tend to think for us? The circumstances where we're not being rational. What are the predictable scenarios that we can put ourselves in when we do things that we don't want to do? And I came up with sort of emotion and ego and social and inertia. And I can give examples of all of those, but a great example of social that I think everybody will resonate with is, have you ever said yes to something you don't want to do? Well, you say yes to something you don't want to do, and you say it on the spot because you have a biological instinct to fit in. You have a self-preservation instinct, and that makes you want to fit in the tribe. So if somebody comes to you and asks you to do something, your tendency is to say yes. And I learned this when I was with Daniel Kahneman one day, and I was sort of in his apartment talking to him, and his phone rang. And so he picked up the phone and he said, my rule is I never say yes on the phone. I'll have to get back to you tomorrow. And when he hung up, I asked him about this. I said, Daniel, what is this, your rule? And he looked at me and he said, well, I found myself just saying yes to things I didn't want to say yes to. And I said, well, that's, we're all in this circumstance. And he's like, well, I just created a rule. And this rule is powerful because what the rule does is it changes your desired behavior into your default behavior at the unconscious level in your mind. We've been taught to follow rules our entire lives. And we've never thought about how we can make rules for ourselves to make it easier and make us less reliant on willpower to do the thing that we want to do. And I thought that was really powerful. So I started thinking about how do we apply these things to the situations? Because if I tap you on the shoulder and say, Scott, you're going to pick your career, you're going to pick your next guest, you're going to pick where you live, in those moments, you're being rational. You're not likely to put yourself in a bad position. You're not likely to make things worse. But if I don't tap you on the shoulder, these everyday moments, these ordinary moments, then all of a sudden you start putting yourself in a bad position. You drink really late the night before a presentation. Well, what does that do? You're in a bad position. And the language that I like to use around positioning is easy mode or hard mode. You put yourself on hard mode. You didn't change what was going to happen the next day, but you changed the degree of difficulty by which you experience. So for example, if I stay up late, I don't get my coffee in the morning, I rush the kids out the door, and then I hit traffic, I'm already prone. The difficulty level here is really high. But if I sleep in, I have a lazy morning, the kids are great, everybody gets out the door on time, I hit the exact same traffic. The traffic hasn't changed, but my ability to overcome the emotion that I feel, the frustration that I feel when I hit traffic is much easier. So I've gone from a difficulty level of maybe 7 to a difficulty level of 3. And it changes the position that I'm in when I get to work, but it also changes my ability to make decisions later in the day.
Shane, let's dive deeper in these four defaults. You call them kind of the enemies of clear thinking. Because I think even just a basic peripheral knowledge allows us all to be a little more self-aware about how we fall into these traps. There's 4 of them. You call them the emotion default, the ego default, the social default, you talked about it a bit, and the inertia default. Let's take a minute or 2 on each of these. I'll pitch them back to you first. These, again, these are the enemies of clear thinking. And so I'd like everybody that's listening and watching right now just to take a moment, put your phone aside. If you're in your car, pull off to the side of the road. If you're on the treadmill or whatever you're doing, I'd like you to take a moment for the next maybe 8 or 10 minutes and just unnaturally check in. That's called clear thinking, because I'd like for Shane to give us a little bit of a primer on what I think a lot of us fall into these 4 defaults. Let's talk first about the emotion default.
So when you're angry, you don't make good decisions. When you're fearful, you don't make good decisions. When you're blinded by love, you don't make good decisions. So whenever emotion, when we're feeling something and it's overpowering, it's consuming us, we respond like animals. We react without reasoning. So if we're driven by emotion, we're going to do things that don't serve us. We're going to do things that are reactionary without thinking. I work with a lot of investors. A lot of those investors have rules around trading, rules around positions, when to sell, when to hold. Why? Because emotion gets a hold of you. Greed gets a hold of you. Fear gets a hold of you. And you end up panicking and you end up doing something you later regret. You're not thinking in that moment. If I tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, you're about to do something crazy or stupid, or you even sit down and you write about the decision that you're making, well, all of a sudden you go from system 1 to system 2. So you start thinking, you start processing, you start reasoning about your decision making, and you're going to make better decisions. Ego is a slightly more nuanced and twisted one. If you think you're right, you're going to discount information that goes against your opinion. You're going to advocate for your opinion, even if it's not the best solution for the organization. And it just blinds you to seeing things. Now, ego is also your friend. Ego compels you to take on new tasks, and it allows you to build rockets and build cars and do all of these things because you feel like you can overcome these things. And so on one hand, it really helps you. And on one hand, it really hurts you. And the question is, am I thinking, or is ego just driving my behavior here? And the default is that ego drives a lot of our behavior. And it really dissuades the information that we have. And if you think about decision-making, the big problem with decision-making is blind spots. We don't see the future. We don't see information that we should see. We don't consider it. And when you put that into perspective, ego really narrows what we can see in the information that we're using to make decisions. Before I worked in management, I used to think, when I was like 21, I'd look up at these people and I'd be like, these people make stupid decisions. They're crazy. What are they doing? And then when I got into management, I'm looking at the information they have to make decisions with. And I'm like, well, they're making perfectly rational decisions based on the information that they're provided. But that doesn't mean the information that they're provided is the best quality of information. Why? Because everybody filters that information going up. Their personal ego is involved. They want to look good in front of the organization. They're posturing. There's political culture involved. And so everybody just sort of takes information and massages it just a little, and it sort of ends up like that kindergarten game, right? You don't hear something, you hear something else, and you pass that along. And before you know it, you're making decisions on inaccurate information. Social, we already explored a little bit. Inertia is more like, you stay in relationships or you stay in a job that you might not want to be in, that might not be satisfying for you. Why? Because you've always been doing it. You keep doing the things that you've always done despite not getting the results that you want to get. And you have to realize that you are the architect of your own life, but you're not conscious about these things in the moment. You just sort of feel stuck and you think you're doing it. And I felt that way towards the end of my career in the government.
Shane, in your book, Clear Thinking, you talk about these 4 defaults. You call them the enemies of clear thinking. And then you also go on to a second part about all the strengths that we all should be more competent around in order for us to exercise better thinking. Strengths like self-accountability, self-knowledge, self-control, and self-confidence, and a few others. I especially enjoyed the chapter around self-confidence because I've always been a fan of having strong self-confidence, maybe even a little bit of an inflated sense. Sometimes you need that in moments of pressure or lack of clarity. Talk about the upside and the downside of self-confidence.
Well, I'm going to mention two specific aspects of confidence that I think you really need to focus on. And they're two lenses into the same problem. And I remember taking my youngest son out on the boat. And we get to a cliff, and he really wants to go off this cliff. The problem is, if you climb up the side of this cliff, you can't really climb down. You have to jump down. It's very unsafe to climb down. It's a lot safer to climb up. So he goes ahead of me. He insists he wants to do this. We get to the top, and he looks down, and there's 25 feet, and he's, I think, 9 or 10 at the time. And he looks down, and he's like, I'm not jumping. And I was like, well, we have a problem, right? Because you're either jumping or I'm going to throw you down because you can't climb down. If you slip even the slightest little bit when you climb down, you're going to hit your head on a whole bunch of rocks, and that's not going to work. So you really have to jump in. It's much safer for you to jump in. And he's looking down, and he's looking down, and he's like, I don't want to jump. And I was like, well, step back for a second. Okay, first thing we're going to do is get control of our physiological state, our breathing. Okay, calm down. Now, I want you to tell me the inner monologue that's going on in your head. What is the story that you're telling yourself? So he's like, it's so far. I've never done this before, et cetera, et cetera. I was like, pause for a second. Well, let's think about all the things that you've never done before that you did for the first time, right? You went snowboarding. Well, that was the first time for something. You had never done that before. You went wakeboarding. Well, there's the first time for that. You had never done that before. You lived through a pandemic, you endured all of these different things that you've never done before. I've never done before. We did that together. And so you can do things for the first time. And then that confidence sort of like starts to build a little bit. And then the most important thing here is I'm like, don't look down. If you look down, you sort of are focused on the wrong thing. What you need is next step confidence. And that I developed this with my son. I was like, you just need the confidence to take one step off the edge. You don't need the confidence to make it all the way to the bottom, because the confidence required to make it all the way to your outcome is much higher than the confidence required just to take a step off. So eventually he sort of walks up to the edge. He doesn't look down. And he sort of jumps off. He takes a big step forward. He hits the water. And before you know it, he's climbing back up and he wants to do it again. And there's another interesting thing about confidence that sort of gets in the way. And a different lens into this exact same problem is often we don't start something. We know we want to do something. So we get bogged down in the research of doing it, but we don't actually start. We don't take the first step. And when I talk to people about why they don't take the first step, what it is about getting in the way, they always talk about the outcome. And that would sort of be like running a marathon, and you sort of hit a wall at mile 3 or 4 and your legs start hurting, and the pain that inevitably comes through a marathon. And if you are focused on the finish line in that moment, if you talk to any athlete, they are not focused on the finish line. They're focused on, oh, there's a stop sign up ahead. Can I make it to the stop sign? There's a red light up there. Can I make it to the red light? What they're doing is they're narrowing the gap between where they are and where they want to go. And then they just do that over and over again. And eventually momentum builds. You push through the pain, you push through this, and all of a sudden you're in a groove. And it's the same way with us. Often what paralyzes us when we don't start something is that we're focused on the ultimate outcome when we should be focused on, am I going in the right direction? Okay, what's the first step that I can take? What's the smallest step that I can take today to make progress towards that outcome?
Let's use what you just said and apply it to Brain Food. This is your newsletter that has just shy of 750,000 subscribers. I'm guessing that growth and influence wasn't linear. I'm guessing there was a little bit of an up and down. Take a few minutes, talk about what Brain Food is, why you established it, how you use it, how recipients use it, and maybe share a couple of wins and losses along the way to embolden other companies, organizations, consulting firms, people, brands that may be looking to do something similar.
So Brain Food is my personal newsletter to other people. And in 5 minutes a week, we focus on timeless insights that you can use at work or home. That's it. It's very inspirational. It's very insightful in the sense of you can read one from 2 years ago and it feels like it was written today. There's no politics, there's no spam, there's nothing topical. It's about what are the enduring lessons that we can learn to make us better people, to make better decisions, to live a more meaningful life. And we're doing snippets. The whole theme of Farnam Street and the Knowledge Project is mastering the best of what other people have already figured out. I'm trying to apply other people's insights to life in order to accomplish my goals. The newsletter, I mean, I want to reach more people, but I really want to impact people. And so I measure impact by how many people are opening the email. That's a huge sign of impact for me. And traditional newsletters sort of get 20%, maybe 30% open rates. We're north of 45, 50% on a weekly basis. And that tells me we're matching the promise that we're giving people. We're consistently delivering value to people. And then you go through these phases where, every Sunday I send out this email. And even though there's nearly 750,000 people on our email list, everybody who unsubscribes, it's like a little ping to my heart. It's like, oh no, I didn't deliver for that person today. And so you also have to make up this. There's a logistics problem, right? So every email you send will have a certain number of unsubscribes. And then you have to make up that gap. And so you have to attract enough people to your website. You have to market yourself effectively. You have to give people a reason to sign up for this. And then you have to consistently deliver value. The interesting thing is we've been doing this for 10 years. I have written 500, and I think it was 80 something. 580 was this past Sunday. And so I've written 580 of these. And if you go back and you look at the first one and you look at this one, they've changed. And that's a natural progression. They should change because I've changed. I'm a different person. I have different experiences. I'm going through a different phase of life.
I mean, 730,000 subscribers over 10 years. I mean, it's a pretty remarkable impact. For other people that may be pursuing the same thing, I don't want to get fixated on your newsletter, but there's so much insight to be teased out of you. What are some of you mentioned them, share maybe some more principles. Every company has a newsletter, right? Every thought leader, every brand has a newsletter. What are some key principles that maybe you've either broken or you've followed, or both, to build the influence that Brain Food has today?
I think one of the mistakes that people make with corporate communication specifically is they're trying to communicate to a large audience. When I write a newsletter, I'm trying to communicate with myself. I'm speaking to an audience of one. And my goal is to attract people who are like me, so they'll be interested in the same things. But if I were to set it, I talk to a city every Sunday. There's literally a small city that I'm engaging in. So if I went to try to please everybody, I'm going to start focusing on the wrong things. I might even get immediate feedback to the positive, but long term, I'm just going to be beholden to the audience. I'm going to lose myself. And I think it's really important that you write for yourself and that you write from the heart and what's meaningful to you and what's impactful to you, and trust that it is. If you do that every week, you're going to have an impact on other people because other people are going through the same thing that you're going through. And if you think about humans, like, at some level, we're all fundamentally the same. We want to be loved. We want to be respected. We want to be listened to. We want to be heard. We want to make a difference. We want to feel part of something larger than ourselves, whether that's a community or an organization. We want all of these things because those are very human things to want. And what we try to do is read a lot. I read a ton. And I just take those insights that I'm reading about and I'm saying, this helped me. This was a highlight for me. This is something I walked around, I digested, I thought about, and I'm going to share that with you because I think it's important and I hope that it helps you. And we sort of have 6 to 8 of those every week. And so usually 1 or 2 really hit it out of the park. And sometimes we get all 6 or 8 that hit it out of the park for people. But most people walk away with something to chew on, something nourishing for either the soul or the brain, or something that they can use today to make a difference and get better at their job, get better as a parent, get better with their partner, and become the person that they're capable of being. Become the best version of yourself, if you will.
Have you found any psychographics or insight statistics on how long the average person reads a newsletter? They need to have a great tip that's relevant to them in the first part to scroll down. Anything you might share? You've been so successful on this through a lot of trial and error and momentum and probably some inertia on it as well. Anything else you might share about it?
Well, reading has changed a lot. When we first started, we were writing longer newsletters, and I think people's attention spans have remarkably shortened. So our goal is to give you something within 7 seconds that you can use. That's how much time you have to capture somebody's attention. I think it's 8 seconds. If you don't capture their attention in 8 seconds, they're gone. So your first sentence always is super important. The first insight that you promote is really important. But then you just tell people where to go to get more. So if you want more about this, here's where you can follow on. Here's the source of this information. Here's where you can go to consume more of this. But if it's not for you, go to the next thought. And people just skim things now. And so it's really important that those headings, those leading paragraphs really convey depth, understanding, knowledge, and fluency in what you're talking about.
Vast majority consume your newsletter on their mobile phone?
Yeah, I think we're 60, 70% mobile phone consumption.
Hey,
and we're not trying to get people to click through to anything. We're not trying to give people a call to action most of the time. We're just trying to provide value to people. And the way that we tell that is open rates over time. And sort of how long have people been subscribers? What's the average subscriber length? And when we're an average subscriber length of like 3 or 4 years, I think that means every Sunday for 3 or 4 years, the average subscriber we have, we've delivered a lot of value to, and I love that. And it's really fun when we get mentioned in the New York Times or the Economist or the Financial Times. We have all this influx of new people, and they're like, I had no idea that I didn't even have an idea you existed before. I've signed up my whole family. We talk about it now when we get together for Sunday brunch, and I think that that's just amazing.
I'm delighted for your success. Why did you pick Sunday as the one day a week you distribute?
Because it was the day of the week when I was lazy in bed. So I was like, what do I want to consume in bed? Like, so if you think about the week for me, and this was totally selfish, Monday through Friday is organized around kids and work. And Saturday was sort of like you were out late Friday, maybe at dinner, you had a little bit too much to drink. So you're kind of slow and groggy getting up. So hitting you with a bit of like brain juice is not the best way to go. And, Sunday mornings were sort of like I had really good energy. I would do long runs, but I would also lie in bed a little while. And I'm like, okay, I want to do something. And what's the first thing everybody does? They pick up their phone. And I was like, this is what I want to read on a Sunday morning, something inspirational, something timeless, something that's going to make me smarter, that doesn't expire. And so much of what we're consuming, what we give people, if you go back and read old newsletters for people, it's like it expires. And so it's almost like news. And I don't read news. I find news to be a waste of consumption time. I want something that we can compound, something that we can add to, depth that we can add, different perspectives we can add to people.
Shane, in your book, Clear Thinking, you have a whole section around knowing your weaknesses. And within that, a subsection about blind spots. This is a topic I'm passionate about because I am convinced after 30 plus years myself in the leadership development space, having authored 7 books myself on these topics, we all have blind spots, and there usually are downfalls. And as I was reading this chapter from your book, I was making a list of my own blind spots, kind of being really brutally honest. Will you talk a little bit about the power of knowing your weaknesses, maybe some hacks or tips on becoming more aware of them, and touch on this concept of blind spots? We've all heard about it. I'm not sure how many people sit down and write out their blind spots and put a plan together on how they're going to address them, avoid them, or mitigate them with talent around them. Riff on that for a bit.
So I think we're all familiar with cognitive biases. And if you look at cognitive biases, the source of all cognitive biases is that we have the wrong frame or perspective in the moment. We have a blind spot. And that's really important. We learn about this in physics, but we don't learn about it in a way that makes a difference, in a way that matters. In physics, you're sort of taught you're standing on a train, the blinds are down to the train, you're holding a ball, and how fast is the ball moving? Well, relative to you standing in the train with the windows closed, the ball isn't moving at all. But to somebody watching the train go by, the ball is moving at 60, 80 miles an hour. And so your frame of reference determines everything. If you're sitting in your office listening to this, or you're sitting down listening to this, and I ask you how fast you're moving, you would say, I'm not moving at all, because you have a blind spot. Now, if I say, put yourself in the perspective of the sun, and now ask yourself how well you're moving or how fast you're moving, I think it's like 18,000 miles an hour around the sun is how fast we're moving, not to mention the Milky Way galaxy is constantly expanding and moving at the same time. And so blind spots are the source of all problems with decision-making. Another way to think about this is poker. If you're sitting at a poker table with 5 people and you can see everybody else's hand, how often are you going to play your hand poorly? Well, you're never going to play your hand poorly because you can see everybody else's hand. That doesn't mean you're going to win, but the name of the game is to eliminate blind spots. The problem is we have a really hard time going back to physics. We're standing on the train, we're holding this ball. So we have a really hard time seeing our own blind spots, but other people can see our blind spots and point them out a lot easier than we can. Or we can consciously take time to shift our perspective and ask ourselves, how do other people see us? How does this impact other people? when you think about going to a meeting and you're pitching something or you're presenting something, asking yourself, just mentally going through the room, how is Dan going to see this? How is Carla going to see this? How is Tim going to see this? What's important to them? What you're doing is you're just getting at your blind spots because you're driven by the way that you see things. But if you really want to get other people on board, you have to see things through their eyes and find the win-win in those relationships.
Shane, talk about Farnam Street. What is it? Why did you name it such? And why would anyone choose to visit it?
So Farnam Street, well, remember the original website was 68131-blogger.com or 68131-1440.blogger.com. And I developed this following. I think somebody on Wall Street picked it up and passed it around. And I remember working at the intelligence agency. And one day, 4 years after I started this, my boss came in and he's like, get this printout. And he's like, you should read this. This article is pretty good. And I looked and I'm like, oh God, I wrote that. I'm in trouble, right? I was like so fearful. And sort of like I hadn't been monitoring the website. I didn't know that many people were reading it. I wondered what was going on at the time. And so I started digging into it and I was like, oh, I opened this email account that I hadn't opened in years because you have to have an email account associated with your website. And people had emailed me and they're like, I love your website, but I hate the name. So I wanted something easier for people to type in, but I wanted to maintain the homage that I had to Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. So 68131 is the zip code in Omaha, Nebraska of Berkshire Hathaway's offices. 1440 is their unit number in Hewitt Plaza. And so what I wanted to do was say, hey, okay, I'm just going to call it Farnam Street because that's the street that Berkshire Hathaway's offices is on. And people didn't know how to spell Farnam Street. So now it's just fs.blog. But that's where the name Farnam Street came from. And Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett have had such an impact on my decision-making. And, they've helped the intelligence community more than they can even imagine.
Shane, what's next for you? You've got your hands on lots of things. You're writing, you're blogging, you're speaking, you're coaching. You have a course called Decision by Design. You have a newsletter we've talked a lot about, Brain Food. What's next on your horizon?
Well, we have 4 books coming out this fall called The Great Mental Models. And so I remember talking to Charlie Munger one day, and he's like, you just need to understand the big ideas of the world. And then I mapped that towards my education, which was very specialized in technology and computers. And I thought about, well, what would it take to acquire these mental models? And I was talking to my kids one day about mental models, and they're like, where's the book on mental models? And so we created 4 books, 4 volumes that across thinking tools, physics, chemistry, biology, and we put all of these 101 classes in university into terms and ways that you will use. There's not a lot of math, but how do we apply this? How can I see the world differently? How can I remove my blind spots? How can I learn a little bit about physics to help me see things, help me see relativity? How can I learn a little bit about chemistry to help me understand thermodynamics, but not in the chemical sense in terms of how I apply this? How can I learn a little bit about business so I understand supply and demand and when it breaks and when it's useful? And how can I learn how to apply these things and not in a real world setting, which is something that our university teachers never taught us? The first book is called General Thinking Concepts. And we cover things that aren't really taught in school, like second order thinking, which is, and then what? You make a decision and you think about the immediate decision, but you don't think about the ultimate decision. So you eat a candy bar. Well, that's an example of something, that is probably not good for you, but it's going to be a first order positive, second order negative. You get the sugar rush. It feels great. Second order is you crash. You do it day after day. You repeat these small errors, and all of a sudden you wake up and you're in an unhealthy state. And so we sort of talk about how we can apply these thinking tools. The clear thinking is more about what are the predictable moments where we're going to be irrational, and how do we change those? How do we create rules around them? And how do we create structure in our environment so that we can turn our desired behavior into our default behavior?
Shane, are these 4 standalone books? Are they part of a set? Are they launching at the same time? Tell us
they're
about
all
that.
coming out October 17th. If you go to fs.blog/tgmm for The Great Mental Models, you can see them all. They're all standalone books. You can order the one that you think you're most going to like, and then you can order the whole set if you find them interesting. We've already published them. We self-published them for years, and then we ended up rewriting part of them. I ended up rewriting part of them and selling it to Penguin. And so now we're just publishing them all at once. And we've sold hundreds of thousands of copies. These are Wall Street Journal bestsellers that we're self-published out of Ottawa, Canada. But for any of you thinking of running your own publishing company, which I've done for the past 5 years, I highly recommend against it.
I was going to say don't, no matter what you said.
Yeah.
Very exciting. Perhaps we'll invite you back on if you'd be interested to talk about those four. Shane Parrish, founder of Farnam Street, author and distributor of Brain Food, the newsletter, weekly distributed on Sundays, and the author of this book, Clear Thinking, Turning Ordinary Moments into Extraordinary Results. Shane, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.